Yep, I'm recording you. Friends, there's a new feature showing up in neighborhoods across this country, and it's not a pool or a clubhouse or a walking trail. No, it's a camera. Specifically, it might be a flock safety camera or one of those Axon systems or an automated license plate reader sitting at the entrance to a subdivision or a business district or maybe some public stretch of road. Police departments, HOAs, property managers, and private communities all over are installing these things fast. I'm sure you've heard about them. If you haven't, you will soon. Supporters of these things say that they cut crime and they help catch stolen vehicles. Critics, on the other hand, say that they're building a surveillance network on people who've done nothing wrong, like you and I. And that fight is already happening in the news, but there's a question that almost nobody in the real estate or the appraisal and the lending industries are asking, and it's the one that actually matters to people like me. Does this currently, or will this in the future, move home values? Now, I'm not here to argue politics. I'm just here as an appraiser. And our job as appraisers is to study buyer and market behavior and what drives demand, what drives marketability, what moves price. If enough buyers start caring about neighborhood surveillance, we don't get to sit this one out. And here's the honest answer up front because I've done the research. There is no solid US data yet proving that these systems move price one way or the other. The technology, in a sense, is outrunning the research at this point. But I'm sure it'll start to show up in the market data. But it should bother you that there's not enough or more data at this point because it means most appraisers, heck, most real estate pros, are going to be flying blind on this the first time it actually shows up in a transaction. And it will. Security versus surveillance, that's kind of the argument. It's the real fight, and it's emotional. It's not logical. At least that's what they're telling us it's about. One buyer sees a camera at the entrance and thinks, good, somebody's watching this place, and this place feels a little bit safer because of it. Another buyer sees that exact same camera and thinks, why is this thing recording everyone who comes in and goes? Same camera, same street, two completely different reactions. And real estate, as many of you know, is driven by emotion a lot more than any one individual, myself included, like to admit. Buyers often build a logical case for buying something after they've already made the emotional decision. I know I often do. They'll tell you that they chose a house, for example, for the square footage or the location, or maybe it's the school district. It doesn't really matter because the reality that is underneath all of that is a feeling, an emotion. Does this place feel safe? Does it feel private? Does it feel like home? And a camera can shift that feeling in either direction depending on the individual. And the only question worth asking is whether enough buyers care about it to actually move the market. Now, there is some research on this topic. There's some international research here worth mentioning. A study came out in China and it found that higher concentrations of surveillance cameras were tied to higher property values, believe it or not. And the researchers linked it to lower crime and better perceived safety. Now, we don't know who funded that research. And interesting, but as of course we all know, China is not the United States. They're already used to massive surveillance there. Different trust in the government, different privacy expectations, different legal environment. But the study tells us that surveillance can move the needle on value. It just doesn't tell us how American buyers would actually react. Now, here's what we do know. Crime moves value. Every realtor, every appraiser watching this video already understands that neighborhoods with more theft, more vandalism, or say vehicle break-ins tend to see weaker demand than comparable areas, similar homes without that history. And we also know what it does to sale prices at scale in areas where crime rates are naturally higher. I mean, you and I care about safety. Parents care about safety. Older buyers care about safety. Anyone with a nice vehicle in the driveway cares about safety. Now, if these camera systems genuinely reduce crime, which is what they're telling us they do, they could absolutely support value, but that's a big if. If installing a camera doesn't automatically reduce crime, that's where the if lies. Placement monitoring, police response, and community buy-in, all of those things matter. A camera that records a break-in, for example, but doesn't prevent it, or doesn't lead to an arrest, well, that's changing nobody's behavior. So the value isn't necessarily in the hardware, the camera itself. Of course, it's in the outcome. And that outcome could get marketed. In fact, it already is, at least by the companies that are selling and installing these cameras. So don't be surprised if you start seeing listing language on the MLS like camera monitored community or protected entrance. the same way that we already see language like a gated community or controlled access or maybe 24-hour patrol in some areas. We already market security. Security is important to most people. And a camera system is just the next line item. And in a neighborhood, maybe with a real history of break-ins, crime, theft, some buyers are going to see that as a legitimate positive, a legitimate selling point, and not as a red flag. But here's the other side, and it's not really about the camera. It's about the network behind these cameras and the network that all these cameras are connected to. These systems can collect plate numbers, auto plate numbers, vehicle descriptions, timestamps, movement patterns, and of course, depending on the policy, that data can be searchable and shareable. We've already seen some news stories where the wrong person was visited by local police because they said they had it all on camera. So the question quite often is, well, who has access? Who has access to all that data? How long is it stored? Can the HOA pull that data? Can police from another jurisdiction use that info? And can the rules change later without anyone notifying or telling the homeowners in that neighborhood? Now, most buyers are never going to ask those questions. They're too emotional when they see the house. But the buyers who do ask them are often exactly the ones with the income and the options to walk away from a neighborhood that makes them uneasy. Friends, privacy really has always been a luxury, but it's becoming more of a luxury feature because for years, privacy in real estate meant usually acreage and trees and distance from your neighbors. But increasingly, it's going to mean freedom from being tracked every time you pull out of your own driveway. There's also something of a stigma risk that nobody's pricing in yet. Drive into a neighborhood loaded with plate readers, flock cameras all over, warning signs, and visible security technology, and one buyer thinks protected, and another thinks, what the heck happened here that they need all of this protection and surveillance? It's the same psychology as, say, bars on windows. They might legitimately improve security, but they also broadcast that security was necessary in this neighborhood. A camera system can quietly reduce crime while simultaneously making the neighborhood feel less safe, just visibly by having their presence. And it's not a contradiction. That's how perception works. And perception, to a large degree, is what drives markets. It doesn't matter if it's the stock market or the real estate markets. Perception matters. People make decisions based on emotion. So here's my real prediction. The camera itself is rarely going to move the needle, but the controversy around the camera will. A quiet, unremarkable camera at a subdivision entrance isn't going to register with most buyers at all, especially since they're going to get better and better at making these cameras more discreet. A neighborhood in the news for lawsuits and angry HOA meetings, vandalized equipment, which we're seeing people cut these flock cameras down. Or maybe accusations of misuse, somebody being visited by the local law enforcement or the HSA because they got some data from a flock camera. Well, that's a different story entirely. Because homeowners want to avoid conflict. They avoid uncertainty, especially. Nobody wants to buy their way into somebody else's legal battle or into a neighborhood with problems. I've seen this pattern play out with shared driveways and road associations and AOA or HOA disputes for 30 plus years now. The physical condition of the home isn't always the real problem. The conflict around it is often the problem, and surveillance is just the kind of the newest version of that same story. Now, from an appraisal standpoint, this is going to be brutally hard to isolate. And I want to be kind of straightforward with everybody about that instead of pretending that there's a clean formula coming and some clean adjustment we can make on an appraisal, because there's not. For many of us, depending on where in the country you live, we can't even say with confidence whether solar panels move the needle to the positive or the negative. And it's the same thing with these surveillance devices and these cameras, at least for now. Neighborhoods that choose to install these systems are often already different. Higher crime, stronger HOAs, more rental turnover, denser housing, those kinds of things. If a camera-equipped neighborhood sells for less than one without the cameras, it proves nothing on its own. You'd need lots of before and after sales data. You'd need a legitimate control group and a control neighborhood and enough volume and enough data points to mean something statistically. And good luck getting clean data out of any of that stuff. But here's where I think this actually shows up first, and it's not necessarily the sale price. It's going to show up in days on market. Say 10% of buyers genuinely dislike neighborhood surveillance. They tour the neighborhood, they tour the house, they spot the system on the pole or at the HOA entrance or at the gate, and they quietly cross it off their list. They don't make a big deal about it. They don't say, oh, it's because of this. They just move on. The other 90% are still willing to buy at market price, so the final number barely moves. But the buyer pool just shrank. It just got smaller. And what happens? That home sits longer on the market. That's a real marketability signal. It's exactly the kind of signal that most appraisers miss because we're trained to stare at things like price and we're maybe ignore a lot of other things, marketing time, concessions, canceled contracts, showing activity. Price is often the last thing to move. Now, real estate agents, our great agents, are going to see the shift before appraisers do because they're the ones standing in the driveway. They're the ones in the trenches talking to buyers and sellers. When a buyer says, I love the house, but I don't like those cameras. Or the opposite. I actually feel safer knowing that they're watching the street. If I were researching this in my own market, I wouldn't start with a spreadsheet per se. I'd start with real conversations with good agents who work those neighborhoods. How often are buyers bringing it up? Whether the reaction skews positive or does it skew negative? Whether anyone's walked away from a contract over it, whether the HOA is even disclosing the system exists in the first place, and whether people actually notice it or not. Those are the real questions. And it's the real tension underneath all of this. It's disclosure. Should a seller or an HOA be required to disclose an automated plate reader like a flock system or an Axon system in the development or on the pole at the end of the street? Would a buyer expect to know how long that data is stored or who can access it? And again, can those rules change down the line? And I don't know where the legal line ends up, but from a pure market behavior standpoint, hidden surveillance is always going to carry more risk than visible surveillance. People are willing to forgive things they're told about upfront. They don't forgive finding out after closing that every vehicle in and out of their new neighborhood has been logged for the last 2 years. And oh, by the way, somebody who visited your house last week at a party just got a call from the local sheriff. Now zoom out, and this isn't really a story about Flock or Axon or any of the competitors. It's a story about a physical world that's becoming permanently searchable, scannable. Doorbell cameras, traffic cameras, plate readers, drones, smart street lights, private systems feeding directly into police databases. In the past, somebody might have seen you drive into a neighborhood visibly, physically with their own eyes. But today, a system logs your license plate, it timestamps it, and it makes it searchable forever. And that trend isn't slowing down. Buyers are going to develop stronger opinions the more this goes on about whether we're ready for that kind of surveillance or not. I think digital privacy becomes a genuine property feature over the next decade. The same way home offices and, say, broadband speed quietly became non-negotiables that nobody was asking about even 10 years ago, but now are mandatory. So could this create a premium? Yeah. If a community can show a real measurable drop in crime, buyers are going to reward that, even if they can't put a dollar figure on it themselves. I mean, they're not going to say, I will pay $10,000 more for the camera being there. They'll say, this place feels safer. And that feeling drives demand, it drives retention and reputation. Could it create a discount instead? Also, yes. If buyers see that system as intrusive, as secretive, or maybe poorly managed, where does the data go? How long is it stored? Can somebody else use it? They're not going to fight about it. They're just going to buy somewhere else. And reduced competition eventually shows up in price, especially in the higher end markets where buyers have the luxury of being picky. They have more resources. So this is exactly why I keep hammering the same point on this channel. The appraisers who are going to get left behind in the next 10 years aren't the ones with an MAI or an SRA behind their name. They're the ones who stopped asking new questions the day they got certified. Nobody's designation prepared them for flock cameras, for goodness sake. Nobody's Con Ed class covered plate readers and HOA data policy. The market doesn't wait for your credentials to catch up. It just moves. And the pros who stay curious are the ones who stay relevant. So what do you think? Do you think these surveillance and tracking devices should increase home values? Should people be concerned about them? Do you think that eventually they'll affect home values negatively? Post it in the comments. I'd be curious to hear what you think and what you say about it. Let's have a real discussion about it. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.